The war ended, and with it a chapter of military mich turned to dust. As Japan's submarines, on the symbols of naval innovation and power, lay abandoned in forgotten harbors, the struggle to a tire presence began. These vessels, designed for destruction, became burdens that no one wanted to bear. The meticulous dismantling of these unsupported machines marked the beginning of a new era for Japan, one of rebuilding and repurposing, yet leaving behind the remnants of a past that could not be fully asset. The question remains, what happens to the instruments of war when the war is over and the world has moved on?
The war had ended. The banners of victory were raised, and nations began to count the toll. While the earth was left scarred, the war machine had ground to a halt. In the quiet aftermath, an unexpected question lingered. What happened to the forgotten Japanese submarines? Once the silent predators of the Pacific, these formidable vessels, designed for destruction, were now a burden. And with that, they entered a chapter of history marked not by battle, but by neglect, economic strain, and a struggle to repurpose the tools of war. In August 1945, as Japan faced the crushing weight of defeat, over 100 submarines were in service with the Imperial Japanese Navy. These were no mere vehicles of war, many were technological marvels, among them the I-400 class, which could carry and launch aircraft, a feature not seen in any other submarines of the era. These submarines were the pinnacle of Japanese naval innovation, capable of striking at the heart of enemy territories with devastating precision. But the end of hostilities signaled the collapse of the naval war effort. With the surrender, Japan's naval might was not just rendered obsolete, it was completely overpowered by the need to dismantle the war machine and reconcile with a world that had moved past them. The sheer scale of Japan's submarine fleet, vast and sophisticated, was a logistical and economic burden. At the close of the war, these vessels were scattered across the Pacific, moored in distant, forgotten harbors, awaiting a future that had yet to be written. There were no more missions, no more secrecy or daring raids beneath enemy lines. The immediate task was to secure, decommission, and eventually dispose of these powerful war machines. For the first few months after Japan's surrender, little was done about the submarines. The country was in turmoil. With the economy shattered and the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki still fresh, the priorities of the newly formed American occupation government were focused on rebuilding Japan's industrial base and managing the social unrest. The Imperial Navy had been shattered. Its ships, planes, and submarines were now in the hands of an occupying force. Under the leadership of the American authorities, a program to destroy Japan's military assets was initiated. But this was not a simple matter of burning or dismantling weapons. Japan's submarines, vast and intricate, demanded a different kind of attention. Some were docked at major naval yards like Kure, Yokosuka, and Sasebo, where they were inspected, their valuable materials catalogued, and their operational potential assessed. These submarines, though now obsolete for Japan's post-war needs, held strategic value in the eyes of the Allies. For a short time, there was a pressing question about whether any of the submarines could be repurposed. Despite the initial examination, the realization soon set in. The submarines of the Imperial Japanese Navy could not serve any new function. They had been designed for a war that was now over, a war for which their original purpose no longer existed. As the months passed, their fates became clearer. The question was not whether to preserve them, but how best to dispose of them. Scrap metal was desperately needed to feed the reconstruction efforts. In the ports of Japan, the haunting silence of the submarines was broken only by the occasional rattle of machines working to strip them of their useful components. The hulls, once designed to survive the depths of the ocean, were now being dismantled, piece by piece. The process was slow, methodical. First, valuable parts were removed. Engines, batteries, any technology that could be reused in Japan's new civilian industries. These were sent off to be repurposed for the reconstruction efforts. However, much of the technological sophistication embedded in these submarines, particularly their advanced sonar and communication systems, was outdated. The remaining, less useful components, such as the massive steel hulls, were left to rot. As Japan entered the early years of its post-war economic recovery, There was no room for what had been the pride of the Imperial Navy. The fate of the submarines was sealed in this disassembly. Much of their remaining structure was either abandoned in scrapyards or sunk into the sea. The materials were either too expensive to process or simply too massive to find another use. With each passing day, more of these once proud submarines were lost to history. And yet, some remained untouched, forgotten in their dark corners of abandoned docks, waiting for a final reckoning. As the years dragged on, this systematic scrapping continued, but not without a deeper significance. For the men who had once sailed in these vessels, for the engineers who had crafted them, the submarines held memories of a different time. Their abandonment was not merely a military decision, it was a somber reminder of the destruction that had befallen Japan. By the early 1950s, many of Japan's submarines had been fully dismantled. The vast, storied fleets that had once symbolized the reach of the empire were now nothing more than rusting hulks or scrap metal, their grandeur swallowed by the tide of history. Some submarines were handed over to Allied forces for further inspection, but these were few. Most were simply dismantled, and their components either recycled or buried beneath layers of time. A few were even sunk deliberately, a quiet funeral for what had once been the apex of naval warfare. The fate of the I-400 class submarines is particularly telling. These were the most advanced of their kind, designed for long-range missions and capable of carrying aircraft. The scale of their technology and the potential threat they posed made them an object of both intrigue and concern for the Allies. When the war ended, these submarines were among the first to be inspected. They were stripped of their armaments, their planes removed, and their once pristine interiors gutted. One by one, they were put out of action, with some scrapped in the immediate post-war years and others left to deteriorate in naval yards. The last remaining I-400 submarine, along with its sister vessels, was eventually scuttled, marking the end of an era. This disposal process continued well into the 1950s. Even as Japan began to recover and the United States started to shift its focus from occupation to rebuilding, the submarines remained a burden, symbols of a military past that had no place in the present. What had once been a symbol of military strength became, in a cruel irony, a heavy weight that Japan could not afford to bear. The fate of these forgotten submarines wasn't just about metal and technology, it was about the breaking of a cycle. The death of these vessels marked the final chapter of a war that had destroyed millions and reshaped entire nations. Their quiet removal, their systematic destruction, was both an ending and a beginning. The question remained, what would Japan's future look like after its past had been sunk to the depths, forgotten and erased? And more significantly, what happens when a nation must cast aside the very instruments of its power, leaving behind only traces of something that once held dominion over the seas? The final phase of Japan's post-war submarine crisis unfolded against a backdrop of uncertainty and economic difficulty. As the decades passed, the forgotten submarines continued to fade into obscurity. They had once been integral to Japan's military ambitions, but now their presence was more a burden than a symbol of power. Their destruction wasn't just a matter of dismantling war machines, it was part of a much larger picture, one that involved Japan's painful reconciliation with the past and its efforts to rebuild a nation from the ashes of defeat. By the late 1940s, the American occupation was winding down, and Japan began to shift towards a semblance of self-sufficiency. The once proud Imperial Navy had been dismantled, its assets either disbanded or repurposed. The question of what to do with the remaining submarines was not just a technical issue, it was a political one. The international community was closely watching Japan's rebuilding efforts. The Allied powers were determined to ensure that Japan would not return to militarism, and one of the easiest ways to enforce this was through the destruction of its military infrastructure. The immediate impact of this decision was stark. While some of the submarines were scrapped or sold for parts, others were left to deteriorate in secluded locations. In many cases, they became part of the landscape not just physically, but symbolically. These hulking, rusting structures, now stripped of their armaments, were no longer symbols of Japan's naval dominance but a stark reminder of the destructive power that had once been unleashed across the Pacific. The majority of Japan's submarines were abandoned in various states. The ships that had once represented the cutting edge of naval warfare were now derelict, left to rot in the shipyards or sunk into the sea. Some of the more advanced vessels, such as the I-400 class, were too valuable for complete destruction and were instead sold to other nations or kept in storage for potential future use. However, as the years passed, even these were abandoned. The I-400s, which had once been considered the most advanced submarines in the world, became casualties of time and circumstance. The struggle to repurpose or sell these submarines to other nations was ultimately fruitless. The United States, having secured the defeat of Japan, was no longer interested in allowing any remnants of the Imperial Navy to continue to serve military purposes. The submarines, once designed for stealthy attacks and long-range missions, were simply too large, too complex, and too outdated to find new uses in the post-war world. And so, they were left behind, scattered across Japan's shores or slowly sinking into the ocean depths. However, the process of scrapping was not entirely devoid of value. Some of the more advanced components of these submarines were reused in civilian industries. The advanced sonar systems and communications technologies, although outdated, were still useful for some purposes. Parts of the submarines were sold off for scrap metal, contributing to Japan's post-war reconstruction. In this sense, the submarines were not entirely useless. But their destruction, nevertheless, remained a bitter reminder of Japan's military defeat. One of the most tragic aspects of the post-war submarine disposal process was the loss of history. Many of these submarines were technological marvels in their own right. The I-400 class, for example, was capable of carrying 3 bombers, a feat that no other submarine in the world had yet achieved. These vessels represented not just military might, but the zenith of Japanese naval engineering. Yet, instead of becoming museum pieces or preserved relics, they were slowly dismantled, their stories forgotten. The fate of the I-400s, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, was one of total erasure. The last of the class was scuttled in the early 1950s, its technological innovations never fully appreciated outside of its military context. It is perhaps the complete loss of these submarines that represents the true tragedy of their post-war fate. Unlike some of their counterparts in other nations, many of Japan's submarines were never saved from destruction. While some Allied powers chose to preserve elements of their wartime fleets, placing them in museums or using them for research, the Japanese submarines were discarded, often without ceremony. The vessels that had once terrified Allied forces and posed a formidable threat in the Pacific were now being treated with indifference. As Japan began its rapid industrialization in the 1950s, the remnants of the Imperial Navy became more and more irrelevant. The focus of the nation shifted towards rebuilding its economy, and the military was no longer a priority. The submarines, like many other aspects of Japan's wartime past, were swept aside. The country had to reconcile its post-war identity, and this meant distancing itself from the military legacy that had led to its defeat. The submarines, once symbols of national pride, were now viewed as reminders of the very forces that had brought the nation to ruin. By the 1960s, most of Japan's submarines had been scrapped or sunk. Their destruction was a quiet affair, often occurring without much public attention. The vast, sophisticated war machines that had once symbolized Japan's naval prowess were now reduced to nothing more than rusting hulls, lying forgotten in abandoned shipyards. The few survivors were scattered across the globe. Some were sold for scrap, while others were left to sink into the ocean, becoming part of the seabed. In the years that followed, the submarines became more than just a memory of war. They became a symbol of Japan's transformation from a militaristic empire to a peaceful, industrialized nation. The story of the submarine's destruction mirrored the broader narrative of Japan's post-war experience, the need to cast aside the past and rebuild a future based on peace, economic growth, and technological innovation. In this sense, the disappearance of Japan's submarines was not just a matter of military strategy, but also a reflection of the nation's desire to forget and move on from the horrors of war. Yet, despite this desire to move forward, traces of the submarines remain. A few submarines were preserved in small museums, though these are the exceptions. Most were left to rust and decay in forgotten corners of the world. Their fate serves as a silent testament to the complexities of post-war recovery. The submarines of the Imperial Japanese Navy were a reminder not only of the destructive power of war, but also of the immense difficulties of coming to terms with the aftermath. Looking back, the story of Japan's submarines after World War II is one of loss, not just of military power, but of history itself. These submarines, once poised to change the course of the war, were slowly erased from memory, their technological achievements overshadowed by the very war they had been built to fight. In the years that followed, their stories were buried beneath the weight of history. But as we remember them now, we can see that their destruction is not just a tale of military defeat, but a quiet, forgotten chapter in the larger narrative of Japan's post-war transformation. And perhaps, in the end, the fate of these submarines, lost to time in the tides of history, speaks volumes about the costs of war. It is a reminder that, sometimes, even the most powerful symbols of military strength can fade into obscurity, leaving behind only traces of their once great presence.